This is Scott Richmond
and Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 1015 FM. Good morning, Arnie Sherman. How are you?
Scott, I'm doing good. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you.
You know, we have a very interesting show today, and I have to admit, and I feel bad about this, that I am not very knowledgeable about an area where I should be, and probably our listeners ought to be knowledgeable as well. We have a show today on Africa.
Oh, good.
You know, and I would say that, and I'll include myself, that most of us know very little about the continent of Africa. You know, what we know often is informed by, you know, the media. You know, there are movies about Africa. Most of them are fairly one-sided. There are movies like Blood Diamond and Hotel Rwanda, and Beast of No Nation, you know, that was just out this last year, and Zulu or Tarzan even, painting an odd picture of Africa. You know, it's a continent with 54 countries, 1.2 billion people, the second most populous continent, you know, on the planet. You know, it also has half of the population live on less than $1.25 a day.
Oh my goodness!
Which is shocking, and most people would probably not know that 90% of the population of Africa, of the 1.2 billion people, are equally divided among Muslims and Christians. There's an equal number of Christians in Africa, but I think often, and I feel bad about this. You know, we react to tragedies like Belgium, like Brussels.
Right.
You know, but then you look back and you know, and just looking over the last year, you know, Somalian militants killed 147 students on campus, you know, a year ago.
Right. You
know, Boko Haram, you know, recently had a massacre in Nigeria, 2,000 people massacred. You know, Ebola, 9,300 people dead, you know, and the visceral reaction in the United States usually is, don't let them come here. Right. You know, rather than being sympathetic, you know, to the 23,000 people that, you know, had contracted Ebola and the 9,000 that have died. Now, I'm not sure what the reason is, but we seem to dismiss the horrendous tragedies that are going on in that continent. Right. And you know, and focusing on other things. I mean, there's probably much more press that Prince got when he died a while back than the whole continent of Africa gets in terms of public media exposure. So I thought today we would talk a little bit about Africa and try to get a true picture of what's going on in the second most populous continent on the planet. And we're going to be joined by Stephen Hayes, who's President and Chief Executive Officer of the Corporate Council on Africa. Very interesting guy. I've known Steve probably for over 30 years, and he has spent most of his career working in humanitarian and developmental work. In 2008, he got the Ron Brown Award for International Leadership at the Commerce Department. Right. He's been honored a number of occasions. Bishop Tutu gave him the Humanitarian Award for his organization, the Transnet Foundation, contribution to economic development in Africa. And so as I thought about Africa, I couldn't think of someone who had a more broad perspective, even though he's representing corporations. He has been more of a humanitarian. He was one of the founders of the infant formula campaign, which was known as the Nestle's boycott. So even though he represents companies, he has a philanthropic heart and soul to him, and I think Steve will give us a good insight into what we ought to know as average citizens about, you know, a continent that we know very little of.
Right. Isn't it amazing that we know so little about this continent? Like, you're right, it doesn't garner the same press or
you know, and
attention.
I think we ought to ask them, you know, is it because they're poor and black that we don't pay much attention to them, as opposed to a terrorist attack in Europe? Right. You know, or you know, something that happens in a developed country.
Is it that our business interests are not as great there, so it doesn't garner as much press?
You know, and you know, maybe some countries, South Africa, maybe a little bit more than other countries. Right. You know, because of the struggles of Nelson Mandela and all of that. Maybe some of the other countries like Kenya, because we like to go there on safari. But, I mean, there are 54 countries. I couldn't name half of the countries in Africa, and I'm a pretty traveled guy.
Where do we, it's always interesting. Where are the resources we're looking for, right? Are there natural resources available to us in Africa?
Absolutely.
Right. So what are they? Let's ask them about that. Let's understand
and what you find, interestingly enough, and it may start garnering more attention, is that China is paying the largest amount of attention to Africa and becoming Africa's number one trading partner.
Right. Isn't that interesting? That's interesting that happens. Look, we have a lot to talk to him about. He sounds like he's going to be a great guest. Where is he based out of? He's based out of Washington, D.C. That's where the Corporate Council on Africa. He's been the CEO there for 15 years. He's just back from Kenya, trip to Kenya, and I gave him a call and said, "Well, I need to pick your brain, and our listeners would like to find out more about Africa." And he said he would join us today and answer whatever we needed to know. Great. So let's get him on the phone. We're going to be speaking with Stephen Hayes, the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. And you are listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO. Right back after this. All right, we're back on What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie, and our guest today is Stephen Hayes, the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning to you.
So, Stephen, you're just back from Kenya, right? Correct?
Right.
What were you doing there?
Well, we actually several things, but we have a strong relationship with Kenya, both as a country and as an organization. And so we were looking at what type of programs can we align between Kenya and the U.S. coming up that potentially increase trade and investment between the United States and Kenya. So just a number of meetings. We work with governments. We work with the private sector. And so, you just got to be on your toes for these meetings.
Sure. Were you on your toes? Or on your heels? Were your toes or on your heels?
Most of the time, I'd like to think I was on my toes despite jet lag.
I know. How long a trip is it from D.C. to Kenya?
Well, there's no direct flight, so it was about a total of 18, 19 hours going over, and a little longer coming back because there was a 4-hour layover in Frankfurt. The lack of a direct flight is something that doesn't help investment as well.
Sure. Well, as we mentioned before you got on the air, there are 54 countries in Africa, Nigeria being the largest economy. I think that's accurate. Do you spend, where do you spend most of your time when you're traveling there? Or where is most of the emphasis for the Corporate Council these days?
Well, our membership represents about 85% of all U.S. private sector investment in Africa. So we go where the investment is. And basically, the United States, if you take 10 countries out of the equation, the United States has very little investment in Africa. But with those 10 countries, it's debatable on how much direct investment versus China's, but it's either first or second. But all our investment is primarily in 10 countries. Traditionally, those are the largely, but not exclusively, the oil countries, which are Nigeria, Angola, now Ghana, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea. Then there's those countries that have a broader U.S. investment, and that would be South Africa and particularly Kenya. But Nigeria is still the leading destination for investment.
Would you say, if you were going to take the economic temperature of Africa at this point in 2016, are things going well? Are there setbacks? What is the comparative economic vibrancy of the continent at this point?
It's very difficult. I think we're to say exactly. We're, I think, right at the fulcrum of U.S. and Africa economic activity. But it just varies so much country by country. There are some countries that are just taking off, and you still have the greatest rate of return in Africa as opposed to the rest of the world in terms of your investment, but it's also a higher risk. So you normally would get a higher return with a higher risk. I think there's countries that are rising, especially Kenya, Mozambique, and interestingly Nigeria. Although the issues such as security there are slowing the growth down there. Ghana is taking off, a number of places, but I think Mozambique and Kenya are probably the two biggest areas where we would recommend now.
And what is the attraction for China these days, taking on such an aggressive trade partnership with the continent?
Well, it's Africa feeds their economy. They need the minerals, they need the oil, they need just about everything, frankly, and so Africa has that. So there's just a number of reasons, but particularly in terms of energy, in terms of also the economic demands for jobs and their own population. There are a lot of Chinese now living in Africa, and it's going to be it's already a boiling point in some places, but it's going to be an increasing point of tension on the continent between Chinese settlement and Chinese job holders versus the perception that Africans aren't getting those jobs. So, but basically, Africa feeds the Chinese economy.
Wow, and there is that tension in terms of the Chinese workforce that is now moving into the continent. Correct? I mean, that's already a perceived and real threat to a number of the economies in Africa.
It's the increased Chinese presence in Africa is a reality. Sometimes it's an exaggeration on the tensions, and sometimes it's not. In Zambia, it's already had riots over the issue. Chinese come in and when the Chinese want to do a project, for instance, they can get it done in 6 months to a year. It would take an American company much longer. Part of the reason is that the Chinese bring their workforce in with them.
Right, and we don't.
And we can't, and also they can organize much more quickly. If we need to build a stadium, we're going to have one company is going to have to get several other companies as part of it. The Chinese can come in and say, "Look, we'll build you a stadium within a year." Then they just bring in the different parts from China and build it up. And then the job holders come, and basically, up until recently, they've tended to stay and build their own Chinese communities. So that's been a point of tension. And then the Chinese are well organized, and they own some of those smaller stores and compete with the local market.
Right. And the U.S. way of entering the market is different and not as intrusive in that sense.
Well, yeah, in that sense that they're not. They just there's a lot of reasons for the Chinese having an advantage. The Chinese also don't follow what's called the OECD rules of foreign. They don't have to follow the Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts that we have in Congress.
Right.
There's just a lot of advantages that we don't have.
Sure. Let me switch a little bit to North Africa. Following the Arab Spring period, has the region managed to stabilize? Is there growth in Northern Africa?
I would say that again, it's uneven. Libya clearly has not stabilized. It's in a very bad shape. It's hard to identify leadership. Tunisia may be a little more stable, but they've got their own worries as well now, and particularly being so close to Libya and unsettled leadership. Algeria is probably the most stable. Morocco somewhat too, but then all of North Africa right now is walking, as we'd say, pins and needles. Most of our companies are stepping back unless they really have commodities that we need, i.e. Morocco has oil, and so some companies are going to Morocco. Morocco tends to be more stable, but they're stepping back from North Africa right now.
So, on a personal basis, how do you keep on top of all this? I mean, every one of these countries have its own dynamics. I mean, you can't treat Africa as one thing, just like you can't treat Europe as one thing. How do you keep personally? Do you have staff that brief you? Do you have to get up every morning at 5 a.m. and read all the papers?
All the above. We have, we work closely with the U.S. government in a lot of ways. We do a lot of readings. We put out a bulletin every day on business news in Africa. So we do a lot of research. I have a staff of 25, which doesn't sound a lot, but that is the largest organization in the country just dealing on U.S.-Africa economic and trade issues. And so we hear a lot from our members. So the members on the ground keep us informed of what's going on, because they come to us sometimes and say, well, we have a problem in this country. Can you help us get to or make a change or whatever? So we do. Now, keep in mind, again, 25 staff isn't much, but it's equal to or slightly larger than the entire U.S. Department of Commerce has dedicated to Africa.
Wow.
Isn't that a shock? Yes, it is.
It is surprising.
We have the U.S. We have 8 foreign commercial service officers on the ground in Africa to help our businesses.
In the entire continent?
In the entire continent.
And that's 15% of the world's population. Is that correct?
The entire continent.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
China has at least one equivalent person in every embassy in Africa. And so, in many cases, far more. So, we're at a distinct disadvantage.
Right. So you're in the unique situation that as a private, not-for-profit, you have a bigger presence than the U.S. government does in terms of commerce and trade.
In terms of commerce and trade, I would say in terms of active people, yes. We don't have as many on the ground. We have 3 on the ground in Africa. The rest of them are all here in Washington on different areas. And we also have, I think, one of the most culturally diverse staffs in town. And right now there are 11 nationalities on the staff out of the 25 people. So that makes us fairly diverse by certainly U.S. standards and even Washington, D.C. standards. The U.S. government would say, hey, we've got, our embassies and we have an economic officer, but the economic officer is an economic policy officer usually. The commercial officer assigned by the Department of Commerce, there's just actually 8 in Africa.
Are there some commonalities, however, even though these countries are so diverse? For example, is electricity and power an issue that's universal across Africa?
Well, this may surprise you, too. There isn't a country on the continent right now that's meeting its current power needs. Not even South Africa.
Wow.
Not even, no. South Africa has actually taken a few steps backwards. Around 2010, they thought they were about 13% short and thought they'd be up by 2013. They're now between 15 and 20% short of their current power needs. Nigeria is at 20% of its current power needs, and Kenya, and I quote the president, Kenyatta, who told me that we in Kenya are at 50% of our current power needs, let alone the future. So it's very difficult. You're going to need a consistent power supply to be able to invest,
right?
Or even say even use your internet, and it's not there.
And what's it going to take to get it there?
Obama has a good program. We can discuss whether it's really working well or not, but there's got to be a major increase in the power supply. So one of Obama's policies that came in 2014 was, to which we have been a partner to, is Power Africa, in which is encouraging power companies to invest in power, building power plants throughout Africa. but it takes a while to build a power plant. It also takes a while, even longer sometimes, to get the financing for it. And then you're dealing with the bureaucracy of individual African countries. The power grids aren't linked, and yes, you're right. There's 54 different countries. Although there are sort of regional communities, they still operate as the regional communities are largely theoretical still. They're still operating on country by country basis. There's no regional power block, for instance. So they have a long way to go.
And what role does the African Union play in all of this? Are they as strong as they ought to be?
No, they're not. Not at all. We are the only U.S. organization, at least should say U.S. business organization, that has an MOU with the African Union, which means that we have, and they are very legalistic, so we have the right and ability to work with them on programs. So we're fairly well connected there, but they're like it's like the UN in many ways. You've got a lot of different opinions. You have one country jealous of another. Foreign policies don't mesh. The hiring policy is often dictated by the country itself. One country may get a certain allotment of employees, just like the UN, and so the people managing the AU really don't have a say in who their employees are.
Right.
So naturally, you have a fairly dysfunctional organization, but yet it does provide a sort of a commonality of meetings, allows things to happen. We held every 2 years we do the U.S.-Africa Business Summit, which is the largest U.S.-Africa meeting of any kind. And we did it for the first time in Ethiopia with the African Union as the partner, and it worked very well. But very frankly, the Ethiopian government was far more useful in making things work well for us.
You're listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on Newstalk KGVO. Our guest today is Stephen Hayes, the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa.
So let me ask just a very simple, naive question. There are over between 1,000 and 2,000 different languages in Africa. What language are the business meetings conducted in?
Most of the time, it's in English. The second one, of course, would be French, and the third language would be Portuguese. In most countries, you can get through on English. The Portuguese countries are the ones that are probably most rigid on using Portuguese language, not because they insist on it. It's just that English is not as widespread in some of the what's called the Lusophone countries. Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde would be a little different. Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome.
Wow. So for our listeners, you're doing a make believe we're a middle school class. What are the few things that we ought to know about Africa that we don't know? I mean, just some of the basics that we're talking about some things that may be, way beyond the average listener's, bandwidth. What are the kind of things, is the health and environmental issues there, as bad as we read about them? Is it unsafe in many of these countries to move around? What are the truths versus the falsehoods?
One of the biggest problems with getting investment in Africa, very frankly, is the media in the U.S. You'll get every negative story. There's almost never a positive story unless it's about a little peanut farmer beating the odds or something like that. The truth is there is a lot of very positive things going on in Africa. You go to Nairobi, and it's just a booming community of 5 million people, and it's a thriving business community. It looks skyscrapers, etc. The roads could be much better, but it's still a fairly mid-level developing country, and very close to, say, you and I went to Eastern Europe in the 90s. It's not that far from Eastern Europe in the 90s.
Right.
Cape Town, Johannesburg, by and large, are our great metropolises. Even Abuja is just shooting. There's a lot of economic growth and a lot of opportunity in Africa. There's a lot of challenges, but health-wise, I've been going to Africa. Well, really since '76, but since I've had this job in 17 years, and this is my last year, I've been ill 3 times in Africa in 17 years.
You could be a lot sicker by going to Mississippi for 17 years.
Yes, the health isn't an issue. You take your precautions. I mean, if you're going to a yellow fever zone, and frankly, there's places in South America and Central America that are yellow fever zones, you take your yellow fever shot. If you're going to a malaria zone, you take your malaria pills and so forth. But there is a lot of economic activity. There's a lot of opportunity, and there's extraordinary beauty in the continent. So, but you don't see that. You see the city, you see the slums, and yes, there are slums. We have them here as well, by the way. You hear nothing about but things about corruption. I think we've got a fairly strong case that corruption exists in the U.S. too in our political processes. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in Africa. There's a lot of opportunity. The difference is, though, it is much longer to get through on an investment. You have to understand who you're dealing with. Personal relationships are a lot more important than just the product itself. It takes a lot of time, and if it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. So investing in Africa is not for the faint-hearted or somebody who wants to make a quick killing.
Who are some of the companies that we should be on the lookout for who are investing in Africa and who are making a commitment?
GE, General Electric, is making a very large commitment to it. They're building factories over there. They've put their African headquarters in Africa, which a lot of companies don't have their African headquarters in Africa. You'll find some companies that have their headquarters for Africa in Europe or Dubai and all that. Microsoft is making a major investment throughout Africa and really looking at the areas. I mean, if you look at our list of members, you'll see the leading investors in Africa. Of course, the oil companies are there, but the investment is diversifying very rapidly. Procter & Gamble, Ford, Walmart are all making major investments in Africa now, largely, again, in Kenya and Nigeria. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa. It's just booming right now, and of course, therein is probably the greatest example of Chinese making a difference in investment. It's been largely positive, but Ethiopia is expected to be larger than Nigeria in population by 2050. Wow. The birth rate is that fast, so they've got a lot of challenges ahead of them. In fact, I think now it's roughly 50% of the continent is 15 years or younger, so that has some major ramifications for the future.
One of the things that Arnie and I were talking about before we got on the phone with you was, there are continents and places like in Europe that when there's an issue, when something tragic happens, that's all you hear about on the news, and that runs the news cycle or several news cycles. You can't say the same for countries in Africa. And just curious as to why that is, and is there a concerted effort with you and your membership to try to be more proactive relative to public relations, social media, and other forms of outreach to, direct attention to the continent and to the countries?
I would say not as much as you might expect. Businesses prefer a lower profile, frankly, for a variety of reasons. They've got to be very careful about how they're seen in the country themselves that they want to invest in. They don't want to be seen as contributing to a negative story, and at the same time, they want to stay below the radar to get their businesses done. Yes. So businesses tend to be, prefer to be quiet and under the radar as much as possible. Yes, I think, it's a constant battle on media, because you look, whatever story it is in Africa, you have about a 95% chance that it's going to be a negative story. Not that those stories are false or anything else, but there's just so much more positive. You look at the Ebola crises, tell you what we experienced there. We were sending a trade mission to Zimbabwe at the same time when the Ebola crises broke out in Liberia. Now there's 4,000 or 5,000 miles difference. So everybody freaked out and said, "Well, we can't go to Africa because there's Ebola." It's as if there were, a Ebola breaking out in New York City and saying you can't go to San Diego, Chile, which is just the same distance away, because there's Ebola in New York. It's just people still see Africa as one big block.
Exactly.
I think.
Yes.
Now, we were talking about that before, how people look at it like it's one big country, when in fact it's not. It's a series of...
It's 11,000,
right.
11 million square miles.
Yeah. I mean,
huge.
You can put China, Brazil, Africa, Western Europe, and even India all in Africa, and you still have extra space.
Right, but people see it as as a monolith. If there's an outbreak of Ebola on the northern tip, people don't want to go anywhere on the continent.
That's exactly right, and it is totally safe. And if you go into these, just like I go into Kenya, they have health precautions, making sure if you've, just like coming in the United States, have you traveled to Liberia or Sierra Leone in the last 30 days, or Guinea? Right. And you have faced the same thing when you come back into the United States, and so the precautions are there. They've actually there's some very good systems in place, but yes, it's still not the same stage of development as the U.S. Although I think the U.S. is beginning to regress a bit. But
right. So do you think? I mean, focusing on the negative for a minute. I mean, boats, boats capsizing and 700 migrants dying, and Boko Haram and Somalia militants. Do you think there's a lack of sensitivity? Because, frankly, we're dealing with poor black people primarily that are affected by all of this?
Yes, I do. I think racism does exist. I think racism exists at the highest levels at times. Or you can call it economic classism if you prefer. But I think if it were in this country, especially, or in Europe, if there were 300 Europeans dying, there'd be an uproar, and there's far less of an uproar if it's Africans, very frankly.
Right. I mean, if somebody went into Cambridge University and killed 147 students instead of at Kenya University, it would be a totally different portrayal and the focus on it.
Yes, I think it's absolutely true. I think that's one of the realities of the world. It's like, they can't help themselves. But the fact is that you have far more murders in the United States every year than you do in most countries in Africa.
Sure. But again, as you pointed out, we think of it as a monolith. It's one thing. So what happens in one part, it's just Africa. And we don't say Europe. We talk about France or Italy or Scotland or Germany. There, it's just generically Africa, and it's viewed in a very simplistic way. I think by everyone, including people like us. I mean, that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's why I said the economic elite think that as well often, and it's just can't be helped. Well, it can be in a lot of things, but it's there are challenges, no doubt about it.
Sure. Do you find that groups like the Gates Foundation, the Peace Corps, and others have a good outcome in Africa? Are they appreciated? Are their investment proving to be a good use of human resources and human capital?
Oh, by and large, yes. I mean, the Peace Corps is a great program. If for no one else but this country. And I think it does help, but I think the real value of Peace Corps is it educates a lot of very bright young Americans who come back with high ideals and want to make a difference in the world. So I think Peace Corps is a very good program. The Gates Foundation, as elitist as it probably naturally is making a difference. But I think that I just think that we've got to move beyond the traditional aid models.
Sure.
The Gates Foundation prides itself on being creative, and it is, but it's also still on the traditional aid models. And I think what's going to make a difference is the development of the private sector, development of the middle class, and far greater business investment, private sector investment. Governments just can't employ everybody, and they can't make the difference that a vibrant private sector can.
Well, as you're counseling companies that are investing, I mean, they're going to go into a market where, poverty and illiteracy and malnutrition and inadequate water supply, sanitation, education, electricity, all of those things are factors that can affect their business. You would think, and I would presume I'm correct in saying that companies that invest in Africa have to have an agenda that also tackles some of those issues so their workers can be a productive workforce for their companies.
Well, that's interesting because when I came here to CCA, I said, look, we can't just sell to Africa. If you want Africa to buy U.S. products, they've got to be able to buy them, and therefore we've got to support the development process as well. It's got to be a part of any economic plan, because otherwise you're not going to have the customers to buy in any case. So this is a little harder than you might suspect, because more and more the African countries are rightly insisting that if a company is coming in to invest, then they provide jobs as well. And they're also beginning to put that pressure on the Chinese now. But we have to support the development process if you're going to invest. You cannot just invest in a vacuum anymore. Sure. And so yes, that's right. That does, as one company said, well, that adds cost. Yeah, it does, but it also adds security for you in the long term.
Right. So, I mean, you need a workforce that is prepared to work and not suffering from all of those societal issues that we just talked about.
And that's going to require training. You're going to have to put in your budget job training and building capacity.
Right. So you talked about how Ethiopia is growing. The population is 1.2 billion. Can Africa feed itself?
Oh yeah, no doubt about it.
Because we talk about oil and gas.
Africa has the potential to feed the entire world. I think the figure is, I'll have to check. Worried about. I think about somewhere between 60 and 80% of all the available arable land in the world now is in Africa. Africa can feed itself, and it can feed the rest of the world. But you remember on Eastern Europe, Arnie, and Poland and so forth, when parts of Africa remind me of the way of, say, Poland was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, 85% of the population of Poland was agricultural based and on 1 to 1.5 acre plots.
Right.
That's almost completely reversed now, 25 years later. The agriculture is the biggest industry in Africa, but it's largely just on daily sustenance, and it has the opportunity though to really be both income earner as well as feeding the rest of the world. There's just absolutely no doubt about that. And still some of the strongest water supply is still available in Africa, particularly in the Congo Basin. Mm-hmm. There's just any number of countries that could almost feed the world by themselves, strangely, if you were really to put the effort. But what it's going to require is just the same way in Poland, except harder, is that it's going to require major cultural changes. Most of the continent has lived on just village to village and maintain year to year. There's no storage, very little storage capacity, no cold chain, as they say now, no cold chain supply or refrigeration. Mm-hmm. So you've got a case where in Nigeria they say that the tomato crops, about 60 to 80% of the tomato crop dies, is destroyed in the field itself. They don't get it to market in time. Yes. So there's no storage. So all those issues have to be addressed. But there isn't a country in Africa, even in the Saharan area, that can't feed itself. And a lot of countries can take care of the rest of the world.
You're listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KGVO. Our guest is Stephen Hayes, the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa.
You mentioned the 80s. I remember, as you do, how the Soviet Union / Russia had a huge, partnership and huge interest in Africa, bringing African students to Soviet Union and supporting the Lumumba Jackson University and all that sort of thing. What is the current, posture of Russia towards Africa?
It's a very good question. We remember when they had Patrice Lumumba University, and they were taking Africans mainly to help. It was part of the Cold War, and try to indoctrinate leadership and build leadership, as well in fairness, train people in other fields, but. Then Russia seemed to just, after the Cold War, dropped out of Africa, but now they are coming back hot and heavy, not so much in terms of taking students to, or the political agenda so much. There's a lot of Russian investment now in Africa, and they're coming back to invest as well, particularly construction, some in agriculture, and especially minerals. So mining out of Russia, those three areas especially. Mm-hmm. In North Africa, it's at a standstill now. There was just a huge bump in Russian tourism to North Africa, particularly in Tunisia and Morocco and Algeria and Egypt, but that's slowed down as well.
We haven't mentioned United Nations. What is the United Nations? Millennial goals in Africa, and are they, are they achieving what they expected to achieve?
Well, let's put it this way: they didn't achieve what they stated they were intended to achieve. Whether they really expected to achieve them is another issue. Right. They have achieved about, according to their figures, and I'm a little suspicious of their figures, but they've felt that they achieved about 50% of the goals in the first 15 years, and now they've added, looking at another 10 years of the next level and so forth. I mean, there's progress. I think it's probably, I think the same level of progress would probably have happened without the UN. Frankly, there's a lot of economic development that is just driven by private sector or driven by other nations. I feel that the major contribution of the UN on Africa has been peacekeeping forces. Sure. I mean, they do other things through UNDP and UNICEF and so forth, but I think their major contribution has been, the major positive contribution has been the peacekeeping forces.
Right. When you look at the continent and you realize that the median age in Africa is around 20, you would think the blindingly obvious thing that jumps out is education. How is the development and the improvement in education, in Africa, in 2016?
That's going to be a major challenge. I think education, jobs, and health are all going to be the major challenges because of the age structure. It's going to be very hard to meet those demands. In terms of education, it's very layered. Most of the leaders that I've met, and I think I've met just about every leader in Africa, as well as most of their cabinet, are just very highly educated. They'll have the degrees from the best universities in the world. But then you have another layer of bureaucrats who have, much like our bureaucrats, I suppose, they have university education, but then below that, university education is a rarity. They need a lot more. What they really need in Africa is the vocational training.
Sure.
And I still think it's a major business opportunity if vocational training schools like the Ivy Techs and all that, the vocational tech schools,
right,
would see Africa as a business opportunity. I think they would just be flooded with opportunity, because that's where the training is really needed.
Well, isn't every company that you would mention when they go in, the General Electric, Walmart, Ford, they really must have to have a very substantial training program, given the age of their workforce and the education level of their workforce.
It hasn't been. I think they're just beginning to accept that. It hasn't been that way until recently. You would think it would be natural, but a lot of companies were pressing very hard, and it was an internal debate here in Washington as well. Well, let us bring our own workforce to build this, and then over time we'll, hire and train as they come. What they realize now is they're going to have to do training on the ground. And there aren't a lot of companies yet that are doing that. General Electric now has turned the corner on that issue internally, and I met with their president for Africa last week in Kenya, and they're starting to build training for their needs. But the problem is the companies are still, those that are really starting to do the training, they're training specifically for their company. And so there's a limit on the number of jobs that's going to provide. It may be large compared to, another factory and so forth, but it's small in terms of the bucket of need in a country. So there needs to be larger and broader vocational training schools. So it gives the opportunity for a lot of people to start their own small businesses.
Sure. Speaking about training, Steve, you're retiring this year. I know it's hard to believe that we've gotten to be this far along.
This old.
Yeah. So what are you going to do? I mean, you're not going to just go sit at home and watch, Indiana IU play basketball. What?
No, but not at all. I mean, a lot of people are asking, but I think 17 years in one spot is just a bit too long, frankly. And of course, I know there's people here in Washington that feel the same way. but nevertheless, it's been good to be wanted. But I just think that an institution to live needs to have new leadership, and I think it's time to go. But the other part of that is I have a lot of offers on consultancies. I would say a lot, 2 or 3 right now that I'm considering.
Good.
As serious.
So we're gonna still see you around.
Yeah, I'll still stay active.
We're not through with Steve Hayes yet.
Much to the chagrin of some in Washington, but they're not through. There's still a lot of things that I want to do.
Well, that's good, Steve. We really appreciate you being on the show today. The time has flown. We're just getting a glimpse. We're just getting a glimpse of Africa and the challenges that you've had to manage and participate in over the last 17 years. And Scott and I really enjoyed
very much
chatting with you today, and hopefully we can get you back on again and on another time to talk more
I'd like
about
to.
this.
There's a lot of things to talk about, so thank you.
Thank you, Steve. You take care.
Thank you,
Okay,
Steve.
you too.
Okay.
Bye, Scott.
Bye-bye. That was Steve Hayes.
Boy, you talk about a job that has a lot of trying to keep cats in a bag. I mean, 54 countries and all of those issues compounded and multiplied. He's
got challenges.
Certainly, and somebody else is going to be taking over that mantle very shortly, so we'll have to keep an eye on what's going on there.
We're going to pivot. Next week we have a little more of a local flavor to our story. We're going to have Andy Holleran on air to talk to us about the mercantile and the developments going on there.
Growth versus no growth, change versus no change in a small, western town.
I'm looking forward to it. Arnie, have a great week. I'll see you next Sunday.
You take care, Scott.
Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichman@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290, 1015 FM, and newstalkkgvo.com.